We give them the security and the safety that they need. And we're a very open family, so we talk about things that bother us and things that trouble us.
What Prince Louis saw at their Adelaide Cottage that made palace staff go silent. King Charles and William rushed to make a joint statement nobody saw coming, but it was already too late. The truth about Kate they've been hiding for months just exploded, and what happened behind those closed doors will leave you speechless. Before we reveal what really happened to the princess, you need to hear what Louis said that made William break down completely.
Where each of these environments were built on valuing time and tenderness, just as much as productivity and success. As business leaders, you'll face the daily challenge of finding the balance between profitability and having a positive impact.
The world stood still when Buckingham Palace released a joint statement from King Charles and Prince William that nobody saw coming. For months, there had been whispers, speculation, and an uncomfortable silence surrounding Princess Catherine's absence from public life. But nothing could have prepared the nation for what was about to be revealed. This wasn't just another royal health update or a carefully worded press release designed to maintain appearances. This was something far more serious, far more personal, and far more devastating than anyone had anticipated. When Charles and William appeared together to address the media, something was immediately different. These weren't two royals performing their ceremonial duties with the practiced composure the world had come to expect. They were a father and son, a grandfather and a father, both carrying the visible weight of grief that no amount of royal training could disguise. Their faces told a story that their carefully chosen words tried to soften. Princess Catherine's condition had taken a turn that nobody wanted to acknowledge, and the reality of the situation was now impossible to hide. The statement itself was brief, as these things often are when the news is particularly painful, but its impact rippled through the country instantly. People who had been following Catherine's journey, who had sent well wishes and held out hope for a swift recovery, suddenly found themselves confronting a much darker reality. The woman who had become such a beloved figure in British public life, who had represented grace and dedication for more than a decade, was facing something that even the resources and privilege of the royal family couldn't simply fix. Within hours, candles appeared outside Windsor Castle. Bouquets of flowers began to pile up at the gates of Kensington Palace. Social media flooded with messages of support, prayers, and an outpouring of emotion that demonstrated just how deeply Catherine had connected with people around the world. But while the public mourning was significant, it was what happened behind those palace walls that truly captured the heartbreaking reality of this moment. Inside Adelaide Cottage, away from the cameras and the crowds, the royal family was dealing with something that no amount of protocol could address. This is where titles and traditions fade away, where kings and princes become simply family members trying to navigate an impossible situation. And it was here, in the quiet of their private home, that the full, emotional weight of the announcement became clear. Prince Louis, the youngest of William and Catherine's 3 children, had overheard fragments of conversation. At his age, he couldn't fully grasp the medical terminology or understand the careful euphemisms that adults use when trying to protect children from harsh truths. But he understood enough to know that something was terribly wrong. He understood that his mother, the person who had always been there to comfort him, to read him stories, to make everything feel safe and normal, was absent in a way that felt different from before. His small voice broke through the heavy silence that had settled over the household. The question was simple, direct, and absolutely devastating in its innocence. Where's Mummy? It's the kind of question that millions of children ask every day under ordinary circumstances. But in this moment, in this context, it carried a weight that nobody in that room was prepared to handle. And when the adults around him struggled to provide an answer that would make sense to a young child, when they fumbled for words that would be truthful without being terrifying, Louis began to cry. These weren't the brief tears of a child who had scraped his knee or lost a favorite toy. These were the deep, uncontrollable sobs of a little boy who sensed that his world was changing in ways he couldn't understand. He cried for his mother, for the comfort and certainty that only she could provide. He cried because the adults around him, usually so confident and reassuring, seemed lost themselves. And his tears, witnessed by palace staff who had seen decades of royal drama and crisis, left even the most experienced among them standing in stunned silence. This moment represented something profound. It stripped away every layer of royal pageantry and protocol. It didn't matter that this was a prince crying, or that this was happening in a palace, or that his father would one day be king. What mattered was that this was a child in pain, missing his mother, and nobody could give him the one thing he desperately needed. That raw human emotion cut through all the carefully constructed barriers that the royal family had built around themselves. Palace staff, many of whom had worked for the royal household for years, found themselves profoundly affected by what they had witnessed. These were people trained to maintain professional distance, to handle crises with calm efficiency, to never let their personal feelings interfere with their duties. But watching a small child cry for his mother, seeing the helplessness in Prince William's eyes as he tried to comfort his son without being able to promise him everything would be all right, that broke through every professional boundary. The scene at Adelaide Cottage became a turning point in how this crisis was understood, not just within the royal household, but in the broader narrative that was beginning to unfold. Up until that moment, Catherine's illness had been discussed in terms of medical updates, treatment protocols, and carefully managed public communications. It had been a story about a public figure dealing with a health challenge. But Louis's tears transformed it into something else entirely. This became a story about a family in crisis, about children who might lose their mother, about a husband watching his wife fight for her life. While cameras outside captured images of William and Charles maintaining their composure, while news anchors discussed the implications for the monarchy and royal duties, while commentators analysed what this meant for the line of succession, they all missed what was truly at the heart of this tragedy. They missed the sound of a little boy crying in a nursery, asking a question that nobody could properly answer. They missed the moment when the royal family's carefully constructed public image collided with the brutal reality of serious illness. That collision between public duty and private grief would define everything that followed. Because from this point forward, it was no longer possible to treat Catherine's illness as just another item on the royal calendar to be managed and controlled. The emotional truth, represented by Louis's innocent question and heartbroken tears, had exposed something that the palace could no longer hide. This was a family coming apart at the seams, and no amount of royal tradition or institutional procedure could hold it together. The question now was how they had reached this breaking point, and what had been happening behind the palace walls while the public was told to remain calm and trust that everything was under control. Long before the devastating announcement that would shake the nation, there were signs that something wasn't right. The silence from Kensington Palace had started to speak louder than any official statement could. What began as a routine surgery announcement in early 2024 slowly morphed into something far more concerning as weeks stretched into months without a single public appearance from Princess Catherine. The woman who had been such a constant presence in British public life had simply vanished, and the longer her absence continued, the more unsettling it became. The palace had initially assured everyone that Catherine was recovering comfortably after what they described as planned abdominal surgery. The statement was brief, professional, and designed to put minds at ease. She would be taking time away from public duties to recuperate, they said, and the expectation was that she would return when she was ready. On the surface, it seemed reasonable. Surgery requires recovery time, and even royals need space to heal. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, that reasonable explanation began to feel increasingly hollow. Catherine had always been remarkably visible in her royal role. She attended charity events, made school runs that were photographed by waiting press, participated in walkabouts where she connected directly with the public, and maintained a schedule that, while carefully managed, kept her in the public eye on a regular basis. Her presence had become part of the rhythm of royal life that people had come to expect. So when that presence simply disappeared, when there were no carefully staged photographs released to show her recovery, when there wasn't even a glimpse of her leaving Windsor or arriving anywhere, people began to notice. The absence was total and absolute. There were no charity engagements on her calendar. The school runs that had once provided candid moments for photographers had stopped entirely. There were no brief appearances at events that would have taken minimal effort but provided reassurance that she was on the mend. Even the kind of controlled, managed photographs that the palace often releases during times of recuperation never materialized. Instead, there was just silence, thick and heavy, stretching across a timeline that no longer felt like normal recovery, but something else entirely. Royal watchers, those journalists and enthusiasts who had followed the family for years and could read the subtle signals in palace communications, began to raise concerns. These were people who understood the rhythms and patterns of royal life, who knew when absences were normal and when they suggested something more troubling. And what they were seeing didn't match any pattern they recognized. Catherine wasn't just recovering quietly, she had effectively disappeared from public life in a way that felt deliberate and deeply concerning. The unease grew stronger when Prince William began to pull back from his own duties. William had always been remarkably consistent in his public role. He attended engagements, fulfilled his ceremonial obligations, and maintained the kind of steady presence expected of a future king. But as Catherine's absence lengthened, William's own schedule began to show cracks. Events started disappearing from the royal calendar without explanation. A charity gala was suddenly cancelled. A diplomatic dinner was postponed with only vague reasoning provided. A planned school visit was abandoned entirely, with no clear justification given to those who had been expecting him. For someone who had spent his entire life being groomed for leadership, who had always demonstrated remarkable composure under pressure, this withdrawal was extraordinary. William's appearances, when they did happen, became noticeably different. His smiles seemed forced and tight. His interactions were shorter than usual. The ease and warmth that people had come to associate with him appeared to be slipping away, replaced by something that looked very much like strain. And then, gradually, his public presence faded to almost nothing, becoming a pale shadow of what it had been just months before. Inside Kensington Palace, communications advisors were working overtime to manage the growing crisis. They issued brief statements about privacy and the need for rest, hoping that the public would accept these explanations as reasonable and compassionate. The strategy seemed to be based on the assumption that if they could just maintain a calm front, if they could avoid giving any specifics that might fuel speculation, the situation would eventually resolve itself. But the approach had the opposite effect. Rather than reassuring people, the vagueness and the carefully avoided details only made them more suspicious. Every non-answer, every vague update, every carefully worded statement that said nothing concrete while taking many words to say it, added fuel to the fire of speculation. The public wasn't being reassured by the palace's attempts at discretion. They were becoming increasingly unsettled by what felt like deliberate evasion. And the more the palace tried to contain the situation through controlled silence, the more obvious it became that something significant was being hidden. The press, which had initially respected the family's request for privacy, began to sharpen their focus. This was no longer just a story about a royal recovering from surgery. This was a mystery that demanded investigation. Global news outlets dispatched reporters to hospitals known to treat members of the royal family. Photographers with powerful lenses began camping outside Windsor, hoping to catch even the faintest glimpse of Catherine through a window or being escorted to a car. But despite their efforts, despite equipment that could capture details from extraordinary distances, not a single image emerged. The most persistent photographers, veterans who had been following Catherine for more than a decade and knew her routines and patterns intimately, found themselves completely shut out. These were professionals who had built careers on their ability to find and photograph members of the royal family, even when efforts were made to keep them out of sight. Yet they were coming up empty. The world's most photographed woman had managed to vanish so completely that even the most experienced paparazzi were admitting defeat. And that impossibility only added to the growing sense that something was very, very wrong. The narrative began to shift dramatically at this point. What had started as concern about a health issue was transforming into something darker. On front pages and in broadcast news, the question was no longer about when Catherine would return, but about what the palace was hiding. The whispers grew into open speculation. Some theories were outlandish and easily dismissed, but others were disturbingly plausible. All of them, however, pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. The palace was keeping something back, something significant, something that they believed was too sensitive or too troubling to share with the public. Even within royal circles, anxiety was spreading. Palace staff members, the people who worked behind the scenes and had daily interactions with the family, began noticing changes. They saw the tension in William's posture, heard the strain in his voice, noticed something haunted in his eyes. They observed hurried footsteps in corridors that were usually calm and ordered. They overheard hushed conversations that stopped abruptly when others approached. They witnessed late-night meetings behind closed doors, the kind of urgent gatherings that suggested crisis management rather than routine business. Though nobody dared to voice their fears openly, everyone who worked within those palace walls felt the same cold uncertainty settling over the royal estate. There was a storm forming, and the silence that the palace had hoped would protect Catherine was having the opposite effect. Rather than shielding her from scrutiny, it was burying her under layers of speculation and fear. The blackout of information wasn't preserving her privacy anymore. It was fueling a narrative that was spiraling beyond anyone's control, and behind all of it, something was happening that the public hadn't yet been told about, something that would soon prove impossible to hide any longer. While the public was being told to remain calm and trust that everything was under control, a very different reality was unfolding behind the guarded doors of the palace. Catherine's medical team had discovered something months earlier, something so concerning that even senior members of the royal family hesitated to speak about it directly. What followed was a dangerous gamble that involved time, public perception, and ultimately, a woman's life hanging in the balance. The discovery came in late 2023 during what were supposed to be routine health screenings. These were follow-up tests meant to confirm that Catherine's recovery was progressing as expected, not to uncover anything alarming. But buried within her blood work were subtle irregularities, markers that medical professionals recognized as potential warning signs of something more serious. At first, doctors flagged these findings as inconclusive, recommending continued monitoring rather than immediate intervention. They hoped that further observation would show these markers disappearing on their own, that they were simply temporary anomalies related to her surgery and recovery. But within weeks, those early warnings sharpened into something far more concerning. Follow-up tests revealed patterns that couldn't be dismissed or explained away as temporary side effects. The medical team was now looking at evidence that suggested Catherine was dealing with something aggressive, something that required immediate attention and a comprehensive treatment plan. The diagnosis that emerged from these findings was one that nobody wanted to hear, particularly for someone so young and previously healthy. Catherine was facing cancer, and the window for effective treatment was narrowing. However, before any decisions could be made about how to move forward medically, the palace machinery kicked into high gear. Senior advisors and communications staff became involved not to plan Catherine's treatment or support her recovery, but to manage how this information would be perceived. The discussions that took place in those crucial early days weren't centered on what Catherine needed medically. They were focused on timing, on how headlines would read, on narrative control and damage limitation. The primary concern wasn't Catherine's health and well-being. It was the stability of the crown and the public image of the monarchy. Inside the palace walls, a bitter divide began to form. William, who was watching his wife receive this devastating diagnosis, pushed hard for honesty and transparency. He pleaded with advisors to tell the truth before speculation got completely out of hand, before the silence became more damaging than the truth could ever be. But his pleas were met with resistance and deflection. Senior aides argued that revealing Catherine's cancer diagnosis now, coming on top of King Charles's own recent health issues, would trigger a crisis of confidence in the monarchy. Two key royals dealing with serious illness at the same time would dominate the news cycle in ways that could prove catastrophic for the institution. The argument presented to William was that the press would sensationalize the news, that public panic would ensue, and that the monarchy itself could appear weak and vulnerable at a time when stability was essential. In hushed meetings and carefully worded emails, a decision was made at the highest levels. They would delay revealing the full truth. They would downplay the severity of Catherine's condition. They would manage the story carefully until it became absolutely necessary to share more information. The word cancer wasn't forbidden in these internal discussions, but it was buried beneath layers of euphemism and carefully crafted half-truths designed to obscure rather than illuminate. Catherine, ever the loyal member of the royal family, initially went along with this approach. She believed that early medical intervention combined with rest and privacy could stop the progression of the disease. She trusted that the doctors knew what they were doing and that the palace's strategy, while uncomfortable, was perhaps in everyone's best interest. But her body had other plans. The physical toll of the illness became immediately apparent. Her energy levels collapsed dramatically. Simple tasks that had once been effortless now left her exhausted. Her appetite disappeared almost entirely, and the sparkle that the world had always admired in her, that warmth and vitality that had made her such a compelling public figure, began to fade noticeably. Then came the first incident that made it clear how serious the situation had become. At a private charity function, surrounded by donors and dignitaries who had no idea what Catherine was dealing with, she collapsed without warning. The palace security and staff acted with remarkable speed, getting her out of the venue and away from any cameras before word could spread. The official explanation given to those who had witnessed the collapse was simple and designed not to raise alarms. She had a migraine, they said. She had been working late nights and was dealing with dehydration. Nothing to worry about, just a momentary spell that anyone might experience. But inside Kensington Palace, the incident triggered genuine fear. This wasn't just fatigue or stress, this was Catherine's body telling them that the disease was progressing and that the strategy of downplaying and delaying wasn't just inadequate, it was potentially dangerous. The medical team increased their urgency, recommending more aggressive monitoring and preparing treatment protocols that could no longer be postponed. Yet still, the palace machine continued grinding forward with its strategy of concealment and control. A second collapse occurred just days later, this time during what was supposed to be a brief private visit to a children's hospice. Catherine had wanted to maintain some connection to her charitable work, to feel like she was still contributing despite her condition. But her body betrayed her again. She was quickly taken away from the scene, with staff members forming a protective barrier to prevent any photographs or video footage from emerging. Once again, the incident was carefully managed with tightly controlled statements that revealed nothing of substance. And once again, Catherine's own voice and experience were silenced in favor of strategic optics. The doctors were becoming increasingly alarmed. They warned palace officials in stark terms that the cancer was advancing faster than anyone had anticipated, and that every day without proper treatment was dramatically increasing the risks Catherine faced. The medical reality was clear and unavoidable, but it kept running into the institutional wall of the palace's determination to control the narrative. Each decision to delay, to conceal, to stage managed appearances rather than acknowledge the truth became another blow to the woman at the center of this storm. William watched all of this unfold with growing horror and rage. He saw his wife physically deteriorating while the people around him clung desperately to the illusion that they could control how this story played out. He attended meetings where the discussion was about press releases and public perception rather than about getting Catherine the care and support she desperately needed. The realization dawned on him that the institution he had served his entire life, the monarchy he was being prepared to lead, was gambling with something far more precious than public image or institutional stability. They were gambling with Catherine's life, and he was reaching his breaking point. The illness itself was devastating enough. Cancer is terrifying regardless of who you are or what resources you have access to. But what pushed William over the edge wasn't just the disease. It was the palace's stubborn insistence on secrecy, on maintaining appearances, on prioritizing the institution over the person. In the long, dark nights at Adelaide Cottage, William wasn't functioning as a future king or a royal performing his duties. He was a terrified husband, torn between the composure expected of him and the overwhelming fear of losing the woman he loved. And the institution he had dedicated his life to wasn't helping. It was making everything worse. The breaking point came when Catherine herself decided to take control of the narrative. In an unprecedented move that shattered decades of royal protocol, she chose to speak directly to the public without the layers of palace management and carefully crafted messaging that typically filtered every royal communication. Sitting in the quiet sanctuary of her garden at Adelaide Cottage with natural light filtering through the trees, Catherine recorded a video message that would change everything. Her voice was soft but steady as she looked directly into the camera and acknowledged what the palace had been trying so hard to conceal. She was battling cancer, she told the world, and she had begun chemotherapy treatment. The words were simple and direct, stripped of the euphemisms and careful language that palace communications typically employed. She thanked the public for their overwhelming support and asked for something that royals rarely request so explicitly. She asked for space and privacy for her family to face this journey together. She wasn't speaking as the Princess of Wales or as a senior member of the royal family. She was speaking as a mother who needed to prepare her children for an uncertain future, as a woman facing one of life's most difficult challenges. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes of the video being released, it had spread across every major news platform and social media channel. The response was unlike anything the royal family had seen in recent memory. Vigils began organising within hours. People gathered at Windsor Castle, outside the gates of Kensington Palace, and even at Balmoral in Scotland, holding candles and offering prayers. They came not because protocol demanded it or because tradition required such displays, but because they genuinely felt a connection to what Catherine was going through. The carefully maintained distance between the royals and the public seemed to dissolve in that moment. People saw her not as a princess performing duties, but as one of them, facing the same fears and uncertainties that touch so many families. Inside the palace, the reaction to Catherine's video was complex and deeply divided. Some advisors were furious that she had bypassed the established communications protocols. Others recognized that she had done something remarkable in connecting with the public in a way that no carefully crafted palace statement could have achieved. But it was Prince Louie who felt the revelation, most acutely. He was too young to fully grasp all the medical terminology or understand the full implications of what his mother had shared with the world, yet he was old enough to recognize the pain in her voice and the seriousness etched on her face. Watching the video with his siblings and father, Louis's eyes widened with understanding and fear. His lips began to tremble as the reality started to sink in. The question that had haunted the household for weeks came pouring out again, but this time with even more urgency and terror. Is Mummy going to die? The words sliced through William like a physical wound. Here was his youngest child, asking the question that William himself had been desperately trying not to confront, the fear that kept him awake at night and clouded every waking moment. For the first time in his life, the future king found himself completely without words. It wasn't that he didn't know the medical facts or couldn't understand what the doctors were telling him. The problem was far more fundamental and human. Speaking the truth aloud, acknowledging the possibility that his children might lose their mother, felt like giving that terrible outcome power and reality. So, he stood there, frozen, while his son waited for reassurance that William couldn't honestly provide. The moment crystallized everything that had gone wrong with the palace's approach. All the careful management and strategic communications in the world couldn't protect his children from this pain. Catherine's public message had struck a chord with millions around the world, but it devastated her own family in ways that outsiders couldn't fully appreciate. The monarchy's carefully constructed illusion, the belief that control and protocol could somehow insulate them from the deepest forms of human suffering, shattered completely. What the institution had tried so hard to suppress and manage was now public knowledge, permanent and piercing. While strangers lit candles in solidarity outside palace gates, inside those same walls, the tears of Catherine's children ignited a different kind of storm. Tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface now erupted into open conflict. With King Charles dealing with his own health issues and Catherine absent from royal duties, various factions within the palace began positioning themselves differently. Queen Camilla quietly signalled her willingness to take on more visible ceremonial roles, seeing an opportunity to cement her position within the institution. But this move was met with fierce resistance from Princess Anne and Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, who insisted that any attempt to fill Catherine's shoes while she was fighting for her life would appear cold, calculated, and utterly unforgivable to the public. The palace split into competing camps. There were those who prioritised maintaining the public image of the monarchy and ensuring that royal duties continued without interruption. Then there were those who demanded that human dignity and compassion take precedence over institutional concerns. William found himself at the centre of this conflict, refusing to even entertain discussions about contingency plans or alternative arrangements. His position was absolute and non-negotiable. Catherine was still fighting, still present, still very much the Princess of Wales, and no one would be moving forward with plans that didn't include her. Meanwhile, the emotional state of the children became increasingly urgent. Louis refused to sleep alone, clinging to William throughout the night with a desperation that broke his father's heart. George and Charlotte, older and more aware of the gravity of the situation, mirrored the household's anxiety in their own ways. They became quieter, more withdrawn, watching the adults around them with careful eyes that seemed to be trying to read between the lines of every conversation. the normal rhythm of childhood, had been disrupted by something they couldn't control or fully understand. Catherine, even while dealing with the physical and emotional toll of her treatment, sensed the fracture running through her family. She began writing letters, secret handwritten notes, to each of her children. These weren't letters meant to be read anytime soon. They were letters to be opened only in the worst-case scenario, only if the treatment failed. And she wasn't there to tell them herself everything she needed them to know. She was a mother preparing for the possibility of absence in a home that had always revolved around her presence. The act of writing those letters, of putting her love and hopes for her children onto paper, was both heartbreaking and necessary. King Charles watched all of this unfold with a heavy heart. He was torn between his duties as monarch and his love for his family. As a grandfather, he witnessed his grandchildren struggling with fears that no child should have to face. As a father, he saw his son carrying an impossible burden while trying to hold everything together. Charles realized that his reign, which he had waited decades to begin, was now demanding a form of leadership he had never anticipated. This wasn't about ceremonies or diplomatic relations or constitutional matters. This was about navigating genuine heartbreak while the entire world watched and waited. The palace meetings continued, press strategies were refined and adjusted, but none of the institutional machinery could address the fundamental reality that the family faced. Catherine remained in treatment, fighting in relative silence while the world held its breath. And then, when hope seemed most fragile, something remarkable happened. Catherine recorded a second video, and this time the message was different. The cancer was in remission. The words came not as a polished royal statement filled with formal language, but as a simple, powerful message from survival itself. Her face showed the toll that treatment had taken, but also something else. There was gratitude in her voice, grounded hope in her words, and an acknowledgement of the strength she had drawn from multiple sources. From her children, whose love had given her reasons to keep fighting. From William, whose support had never wavered, even when everything else seemed uncertain. And from the support of a nation that had sent millions of messages, lit countless candles, and held her in their thoughts throughout the darkest months. Inside Adelaide Cottage, the emotional response was immediate and overwhelming. William finally allowed himself to release the tension he had been carrying for months. He broke down in tears of relief, holding George and Charlotte as they wept together, processing emotions they had been holding back for fear of making things worse. And Louie, who had asked that terrible question so many times, clung to his mother with a fierce grip that spoke of a child who had been given back the one person he absolutely could not live without. The remission was real and it was cause for celebration, but everyone understood that it remained fragile. The path ahead was still uncertain, still requiring careful monitoring and continued treatment. But in that moment, none of those concerns could diminish the profound sense of emotional liberation that washed over the family. Catherine had survived, and in surviving, she had transformed not just her own family, but the very nature of how the monarchy presented itself to the world.